Hey there and welcome back to another Disney video. And today I want to talk about a little film called Moana, which is, in my mind, perhaps the greatest Disney princess film of all time. Maybe not the greatest princess film of all time, as my heart will always be for Anastasia, but certainly under the Disney umbrella, I think a case can be made. And let's not mince words, the competition in my opinion is pretty steep. There are a lot of different schools of thought about what makes a great princess film, and a lot of it is really quite subjective. There are those that would champion the cause of the classic Golden Age type princess films like Snow White or Cinderella or Sleeping Beauty. Old school films that reflect these old school values and stay very close to the story and tropes of those traditional fairy tales. Then there are those that would say the Renaissance style is the best style. Stories told in a much more grand way, big and flamboyant, with huge Broadway-style singing and musical numbers, but that still have that connection to the original fairy tale, and they still have a lot in common with the values of those older Golden Age stories. But they're also the early stage of blazing a new trail and telling these stories differently. And then there are the new era of Disney princesses, which are far more progressive in tone and substance. Films where we've definitely moved away from the more rigid morality and values of the past, and are injecting a far more modern flair into these fairy tale worlds, whilst also seeing a lot of experimentation taking place. And just for quick reference, when we talk about Disney princess films, I'm talking about the official princess branding. So, Snow White, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Pocahontas, Mulan, The Princess and the Frog, Tangled, Brave, and of course, Moana. And for some reason, they don't consider Frozen to count. And I'm guessing because Frozen's already so lucrative, they don't need to be part of that branding. But you know what? I'm making an executive decision here, and I'm saying for the purpose of this video, they count. Otherwise, the competition gets a lot weaker anyway, and that's no fun. But anyway, perhaps it's my recency bias kicking in, although Moana is now 6 years old, so I'm not sure how much water that argument would hold anyway. But I think the latest era of Disney princess storytelling, the era that really kicks off with The Princess and the Frog, starts to rise in acclaim with Tangled, saw Pixar enter the princess market unexpectedly with Brave, peaked critically and financially with Frozen, and then finished off on a real high note with Moana. I mean, yeah, there's been Frozen 2 and like Raya and the Last Dragon, which also involves princess type characters, but it definitely felt like the end of an era when we hit Moana. The last huge princess film of the revival era, before they take a backseat again and we see different types of films from the studio. And we've seen that in the last 6 years or so since it was released. And of these revival era princess films, I think that Moana stands above the rest as the best overall film. Does it do every element the best? Is it on top of every category? No, clearly not. Frozen clearly has the most iconic songs of the last, 20 goddamn years, but I think the way in which it weaves together the various elements that make up a film is what makes it the best overall cinematic experience. And so, for starters, we should probably acknowledge that this film well and truly caught fire for both critical response and in terms of its box office performance. It has a Rotten Tomatoes score of 95% off 283 reviews with an average score of 7.9 out of 10, and it grossed $645 million off a budget of around $150 million to $175 million. So it clearly did very well for itself and manages to hold its own against the majority of other Disney princess films. Except like Frozen. But that has a ridiculously high box office score, so it would be pretty hard to replicate except when they made Frozen 2. But that really is the anomaly because once again, the Frozen franchise is one of those things that just caught fire.
There was nothing I could do. He just caught fire.
Which is an ironic statement for a franchise with a name like Frozen, but it's true. But enough preamble. And I think there are a fair few reasons that Moana can be considered the all-time great Disney princess film, outside of unfair reasons like graphically it looks the best. Because yeah, ideas like that to me aren't fair, because obviously technology does change things. Is a film like Sunset Boulevard automatically worse than say Thor 2 simply because one of them had access to better technology? I don't think so. As long as it doesn't look awful, it's fine to me. It doesn't feel like it matters all that much. So what can we really rank these films on? What can set them apart other than visual style and appeal? Well, there are two main categories that really come to mind for me to make up the core of what a Disney princess film should be. A fire soundtrack and a really gripping and intriguing narrative. Overall, each good Disney princess film is able to succeed in both of these categories. And we'll start off with soundtrack. Now, I'll be real with you here. If your princess film doesn't have a glorious soundtrack, that it has at least 2 to 3 memorable songs to get stuck in the public's collective consciousness, then it doesn't deserve to have any further consideration. Sounds harsh, but it's true. This is literally one of the most important elements of the Disney classic, let alone the Disney princess film. It's one of the most important parts of it. So luckily, this means I can already knock some out of contention. But unluckily, not as many as you'd expect, because realistically, the composers really do go hard when they get that Disney contract. There's so many different iconic songs that come from this really small pool of films, and the majority of them have at least 2, but usually 3 plus. So on our first pass, we can eliminate Sleeping Beauty. It has one super iconic song, a song so good they repeat it 3 times within the film, probably to try and mask that the rest of their soundtrack is quite forgettable. And we can eliminate Brave on a similar basis. I'm sorry, but one song ain't enough to compete. I get that Pixar doesn't usually follow the same formulas, but still, this just ain't it. And also, despite having good songs, Pocahontas can be eliminated via dishonorable mention with the song Savages. And maybe I'm being too PC here, but this is a kid's film. You don't need a song where some white dudes sing about how native people are savages and barely even human. Yeah, I know it's trying to highlight historical viewpoints and make them look racist, but it does it in a really clumsy way. And I feel like it's just one of those songs that makes you cringe on a rewatch. Like, What Makes the Red Man Red, or We Are Siamese, or Everybody Wants to Be a Cat, you know the part I'm thinking about. But beyond those films, I don't think I can fairly cut out any of the other films from the list. They each have their merits in terms of their soundtrack, and I wouldn't say it's completely fair to say that Moana stands head and shoulders above the rest in that respect. I would say that it holds its own quite nicely, but so do the rest of the lineup. And so this means we have to kind of dig a little bit deeper. Is the story actually good? Is it compelling? And most importantly, is the character compelling? Is the princess, which for the purpose of talking about these movies in this context, is the most important character, a bystander? Do things simply happen to her? Or does she have her own proper storyline? Is her character intrinsically tied to her sex appeal or her pursuit of a husband? Or does she have other goals outside of that? Does she have a life outside the confines of romantic subplots? And what about the side characters? Are they memorable? Or are they basic and just there to have characters for the mains to speak to? Aladdin we can knock out basically straight away on the technicality that this is not a Disney princess film, thank you very much. The cheek of Disney, putting Jasmine in the lineup when she isn't even the title character. She isn't even close to the main protagonist. So Jasmine, you're out of here. And now we can properly start to narrow down that playing field and start to cull a few more films from contention. Snow White is low on character. For her prince, hell, for most of the dwarves, even the evil queen. It's a film of a different era, made for the spectacle of having a full-length colour animation and showing off what they can do. It's low on plot, and it feels like a relic of its time. It feels dated. It's not bad, but it's hardly a masterclass in narrative and character development. And the same thing with Cinderella. Half the time they feel like walking cardboard cutouts, not a drop of character outside the villains and the cat. Next up, I'd have to eliminate The Little Mermaid. From the get-go, the film seems to have it all. Vibrant and exciting visuals, epic songs, fun and hilarious side characters, a really cool villain. But then you get to the plot and the characterization of your leads, and it's kind of a letdown. Ariel starts off the story as a really interesting character, a mermaid who wants to explore the uncharted lands above the sea, who wants to walk where the people are. Basically, an inversion of those old maritime film tropes where the young kid's looking out across the sea, dreaming of becoming a soldier and exploring the mysterious oceans. But pretty quickly, this story dries up, and her character seeks solely to be with a man she has met one time. Not a great role model. And her interactions with her father feel like they're straight out of an 80s teen film where the upper middle class preppy girl wants to go on a date with the mysterious bad boy with the motorcycle and daddy won't allow it. It was good for its time, 1989, but its hyper-focus on obsessive romance driving a girl to give up her whole life in an instant for a guy she's met once or twice is deeply troubling now. Beauty and the Beast has similar issues. Great visuals, great songs, great side characters, but then the story is kind of whack. We're told from the get-go, and from Disney themselves, that Belle is the first feminist princess, a hero for girls everywhere who can empower other girls. Hooray! But her story is about getting sexually harassed by the local Chad before getting kidnapped and held prisoner by an underdeveloped man-child who cuts her off from her friends and family and flies into a rage at the smallest of provocations. So I'm guessing that she tells them both to take a hike and lives her best life, traveling the world like she wanted to at the start. Nope. She falls in love with the monster who kidnapped her father and then blackmailed her into staying with him. What the hell? I like the film, but the base story doesn't feel overly feminist to me. It reads like an attempt at saying, oh look, arranged marriages aren't so bad. Just gotta get to know 'em. And I can't help but side-eye people who claim that this is so deeply romantic and she's such a richly developed character. Nah. And I get that people say, oh look, it's not problematic because she chooses to come back. Like people don't come back into bad or abusive relationships all the time. And since it starts off as a borderline abusive relationship anyway, for me it becomes harder to reconcile the idea of this being an overly feminist and romantic story and character. Coming back to save his life, yeah, I understand it, but I think they could have reworked the romance quite a bit. And since they didn't really update the story for more modern sensibilities, it falls quite short in a narrative perspective. Mulan feels much more like it hits that sweet spot of being a feminist hero. She's a woman who makes it in what at the time is perceived to be a man's world. She rises up from nothing, she rises from her position as a privileged noble to take her father's place in the army. And so she has to prove herself whilst also protecting her identity as a woman, eventually proving that she's not lesser. And she saves all of China. And I mean, this film has it all, the songs, the visuals, the characters, but the pacing is clunky. And her sudden shift from weakling, utter weakling, to the strongest warrior in the camp happens in about 20 seconds of song. It doesn't feel earned, and it makes her character development come across as forced. It's still a great movie, but once again, it's style over substance and spectacle over narrative. They wanted her to be a meek little weakling and then be the badass warrior. But they didn't have the time to actually show that shift, and in the end, it drags the movie down. Princess and the Frog, it's one of those movies that I think deserves to sit on top of the lists of the most underrated Disney films. Because it really does have everything. A great soundtrack, great visual style, great characters, a great story when you get down to it that infuses romance, adventure, and modern sensibilities into one succinct package. The only problem being is that it is very, very, very forgettable, and I don't know why, but it just is. Hardly anybody talks about this film ever, and I often forget it exists. And honestly, whilst I can't quite put my finger on why it's forgotten, I mean, maybe it's because it uses traditional animation or came out when Disney were in a bit of a slump, but I feel like if it was the all-time greatest Disney film there is, then it would be remembered regardless of those factors, and since it isn't, I don't think it can be. And then there's Tangled, which is a great film that ticks all the boxes, and honestly, it's probably my favourite of the films I'm talking about today, but I don't know, at the same time it also feels like a bit of a throwback, a midway point. As a character, Rapunzel has more agency to push forward in her own direction, but ultimately, her arc's defined by her relationship with a man who is her rescuer and sacrifices everything for her. It's his actions that defeat the villain, his actions that save the day. Yeah, she brings him back to life, but that's a fluke of magic, rather than her actions within the story. Without him, she's screwed. And as for Frozen, yeah, its highs are very high. It has one of the greatest side characters of all time in Olaf. It has great songs and intriguing characters, and a story that has a lot of great twists and turns, and even does the good old-fashioned fake-out. The first being when Hans fools Anna, after most of the film telling her that he's in love with her, and so in the process deconstructing the whole princess and prince fall in love instantly type thing. And then at the end, where Anna's act of true love that saves her is protecting Elsa, her sister. And this is actually a really good narrative twist. I mean, they both are, and they bust a lot of tropes, but it requires one thing to be pulled off properly, and that is that for the most part, the film has to conform to the prior stereotypes to make the twist actually mean something. Otherwise you'll go into it expecting it. And so that means that for most of the story, Elsa has to be put on the back burner, where she's a passenger and ultimately she lacks a lot of agency in the film. This changes in the second one, but in the film, she's a bystander. She needs to be the princess for the hero to save, and so ultimately she is. And that hero is, of course, in the end, Anna. But meanwhile, Anna also has a very similar journey, sort of reminiscent of Rapunzel from Tangled. And whilst they parody falling in love with the first guy you meet with her and Hans, they do the exact same thing for her with her and Kristoff. And she knows him for even less time. So whilst this film does bust tropes, it also conforms to them enough that ultimately it muddles the narrative quite a lot. I mean, it's still among the best Disney films ever made, but I don't think it's the top of the list. And that's because Moana exists, and it does everything right. It has an epic score and songs that get stuck in your head, and it has a really fun story that takes you on a journey and has some interesting twists. And most importantly, the characters. The characters are so well rounded. From the chief who doesn't want to leave the island out of fear of the unknown and the dangers of the ocean, to Maui who struggles against his desire to do good and redeem himself, with his inherent selfishness stemming from his abandonment issues that make him want to look out for only himself. All the way to Moana, who is refreshingly the driving force of the film. Completely and utterly, she pushes forward the narrative. The story's her journey, her story. She isn't a damsel. This isn't a fake out. She's the hero. She saves the day. She finds Maui. She gets through to him. She inspires him to be better. She figures out how to restore Te Fiti and make the ocean a safer place for her people again. And she's the one in the end who leads them in their return to wayfinding. The fact that she isn't a passenger in her own movie is so refreshing. It's her actions that push the narrative forward, and any other characters are reacting to her, not the other way around. And so whilst it maybe isn't my personal favourite, I think it's the ultimate culmination of Disney princess storytelling, where every single element clicks across the board to create the perfect Disney princess cinematic experience. But as always, these are just my opinions, and I know they might be a bit controversial for this video, but I'd still like to hear yours. What do you think about what I had to say? Agree, disagree? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know.